Welcome everyone to day 2 of the Institute for the Study of Modern Authoritarianism's second annual Liberalism for the 21st Century conference, LibCon 2025, something we're trying to make happen online if you can help, LibCon 2025. We're so glad you're here. We've got an awesome day lined up for you today. Starting with this panel. Before I get to that, I just want to correct a wrong from last year. Bernie Belvedere from the UnPopulist, the flagship publication of ISMA. And I say that and I emphasize that because last year I thought my intros went really well, except for one thing. I forgot to list my affiliation. And I just wanted to make sure that this year nothing like that happens. Now, I know what you're thinking. Bernie's going to overcorrect this year. He's going to overcompensate. But, you know, that's just not something that I would do. That's just not something that I, Bernie Belvedere of the UnPopulist, would ever do, right? I mean, so if you see things that feel like it's a little heavy-handed in terms of me shouting out the UnPopulist or plugging it, again, best publication, but I'm not going to go overboard with it. Again, Bernie Belvedere of the UnPopulist does not do that. No, but seriously, we've got an awesome panel for you this morning. So let me get into it a little bit and then introduce the speakers. As the post-Cold War international order is increasingly abandoned by the US, and as aggressive strains of nationalism continue to sprout up around the world, a natural question to ask is, what is this world going to look like, and what are its implications? So we're here this morning to discuss the specter of sovereigntist nation states. And the principal danger with sovereigntism, as Sheikha Dalmian noted at a recent convening in Europe on defending democracy, is that fundamentally it seeks to replace rules with force or might as the organizing principle in the world. So here to talk to us about this and other perils of a world of sovereigntist nation states this morning is Jennifer Mittelstadt, who is professor of history at Rutgers University, Daniel Drezner, who is professor of international politics at Tufts University, Francis Fukuyama, who is senior fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and a faculty member of the Institute's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and Nayyera Haq, our panel's moderator, who is assistant dean at Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. So you know how with scholars and academics, you sometimes get individuals who are really good at their scholarship, but not quite so good at public commentary or public speaking? Not so with this bunch. They excel at both, and we're thrilled to have them. Nayyera, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and I'll also make my own shout out for the UnPopulist, not to be too on the nose. Good morning, happy Friday. I'm wondering if anybody else here had felony assault by sandwich as part of their conference experience. No? No. I had to go through 2 checkpoints today to get here to the Watergate Hotel. Only one of them had masked armed men at them, so that was a bit of a relief. And it's fun to be here in this historic Watergate, knowing that about 6 floors up is where Nixon had his tapes going on. All of that to say that we are in a very, very interesting moment, and I cannot thank Sheikha and the Institute enough for bringing us all together in such an on-the-nose way with this conference. With that, since this is a discussion about sovereigntist states, let's start off with some basic level setting of definitions. Frank, do you have a quick definition from your discipline?
Oh, okay. I didn't know I was going to go first, but by the way, I'm not Janice Stein, if there's any confusion about that. If you were expecting her, I'm sorry you're disappointed. Yeah, I just think that, you know, the sovereign is whoever gets the last word in making a decision, and therefore sovereigntism really has to do with the unit that makes decisions in international affairs, which generally speaking is a nation state.
Dan?
So I got my dissertation at Stanford, and my dissertation advisor was a guy named Steve Krasner, who wrote a whole book about this. So I feel obligated to say that there were four different ways you could think about sovereignty. There was domestic sovereignty, which meant who was the highest decision maker within a domestic, within a single political unit. There was interdependent sovereignty, which was how much could an actor guard against foreign intrusions. There is international legal sovereignty, which is the extent to which other actors in the world recognize that you exist. And then there was what he called Westphalian sovereignty, which was the ability of that actor to resist entreaties by others to concede things in terms of their own sovereignty. And so it can mean a lot of different things. But I think the other thing that should be recognized is that Krasner's book on sovereignty, the subtitle was Organized Hypocrisy, which was sovereignty as a concept says, the state is absolute and we don't have to have any intrusion. When in point of fact, if you look at the history of sovereignty, that has never been the case.
Well, from that historical perspective then, Jennifer, what's your definition as a historian?
Yeah, I'm apt to build on what Dan was saying, and also to just concede that historians are totally heterodox and magpies in terms of grabbing theory from here and there. So I think the best way for me to think about is even to sort of pull back even further, maybe, from what Dan was talking about. It's really a formation of politics that, for me, is organized largely, I think, around law, governance and jurisdiction of people and territories. It takes different forms at different times, so that's just to say what historians say all the time, it's historically contingent. So the sovereignty politics of mid-level manager of the British Empire in 19th century Indian subcontinent is going to be super different from the sovereignty politics exhibited by an advocate for independence in 1960s Puerto Rico, for example. I guess the other thing I would say is I do think that they're sort of externally and internally related, so it has to do with international affairs, but also very much with domestic politics. So, when I think of today's panel, for example, I'm thinking about this iteration of sovereigntist politics that we're going to talk about today. I think we're thinking, for me, as a historian, about the development in the US of a particular brand of right-wing sovereignty politics that defined itself against the creation of internationalism in the 20th century. So historically contingent form of politics, internal and external.
I'll throw in the Merriam-Webster definition. This is an interesting one. It is sovereign as in very good or effective, quote, a sovereign remedy for all ills. And then my personal favorite, which is a former British gold coin worth £1 now only minted for commemorative purposes. But I take that to say this idea, if you especially want to start, Jennifer, with the history of sovereigntist movements in the United States, can we separate the idea of sovereignty and sovereigntist movements from colonial and imperial ambitions?
That is a good question. I think I want to start by just stipulating that it feels strange in a way to come up here and talk about sovereigntism and the history of it in the United States as some kind of an expert. I really happened upon the politics of sovereignty in the US by accident. I set out to study grassroots right-wing Americans and their interest in US foreign policy, in sort of local conservative organizations, national conservative organizations, churches, and things like that. And I felt like I was guided by the sort of existing literature, which is really about conservative foreign policy at the highest levels. And so I thought, well, I'm going to keep my eyes peeled for what I know is probably there. It's going to be a good deal of powerful anti-communism. It's going to be a good deal of support for robust national defense. And of course, I found those things. But as I went through the papers of all these people in these different organizations and church members, their private papers and their organizational papers both, what I found was this deep and abiding expression of anti-internationalism, which they then redefined as a defense of sovereignty. And so for me, it was a real open question. Mm-hmm. What the heck is this? I didn't expect to find the language. I didn't expect it to be so pervasive. I had no idea that something like world government was an animating feature of right-wing politics, extending, throughout different levels and all the way back in time. So for me, maybe it's useful to think about, as we're defining it, like it's origination in the US, and for me, that's in 1919. And here, I think, is where colonialism and imperialism come in. So as you know, 1919 is this totally dramatic moment, end of World War I, and there's like these referenda on the table. What do we do about globalization? What do we think of it? It had reached a high point before the war. Countries integrated as they never had been before. That comes to a halt. And then there's this other thing that's happening, which is who rules, who governs? Empires fall, new nations are created, colonized people ask for independence. Within nations, people who did not have the franchise extended to them and who did not have civil rights demanded civil rights. What would happen? And on top of all of this comes this new proposal, the most real proposal that had ever been floated for a supranational governance, the League of Nations. And that really becomes a kind of defining moment for answering all these questions. And some people are thrilled, mostly the people who like self-governance, whether within their nation or within an empire. They would like a world government. They would like a League of Nations that would allow them the possibilities they think perhaps, not only for greater peace, but for self-determination. But I think for others, and in the US, on the right, really sovereignty emerges as a way to combat the idea of the dangers of international governance to their own sense of how they govern themselves and their territory, their nation, their states, their families, their communities. And so it really is, I think, in part a rejection of what I would think of as the colonial aspirations or the kind of internal aspirations of other people for access to power that they seek to preserve their own by rejecting the threat of international governance. And it takes various forms at different times. It's born in 1919, but it persists and evolves. And maybe we can talk a little bit about the other times it pops up and in what context.
Frank, if you can bring us forward from World War I a little bit further on, past World War II, where we do have the establishment of a liberal world order that brings promise to many, many communities. And we now stand with the United Nations that has more than 170 countries that have ostensibly signed and agreed to a set of norms and standards for human rights. Take us on from there of how that has developed in the context of protecting nation-state identities.
Well, I want to actually make a modest defense of a certain version of sovereigntism because it actually extends further back in history. The debate really, I think, arises in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England, where you had a struggle between the Parliament and the King, basically over sovereignty, like who is the final decision maker in the English political system. And Parliament said it should be Parliament because Parliament represents the nation. It didn't, not by our democratic standards today, but they had a better claim to it than a Stuart king. And from that point on, sovereignty was really associated actually with democracy in a certain sense because the parliament was legitimate in a way that the king wasn't, and therefore any diminution of parliament's sovereignty was a diminution of the ability of the English people to rule themselves. And there's an element of that, I think, that is still in a part of right-wing discourse. You can put it in a modern context in the following way, and this explains why America has been unwilling to join a whole lot of international pacts and agreements over the years compared to other European countries. For example, Americans really bridle if they are being criticized by an international human rights body, by a group that's made up of Iran, Syria, Cuba, and so forth. And I think Americans rightly say, why the hell do we have to listen to this international group that are not democratically legitimate, that are criticizing us who really do have legitimate democratic institutions? And I think that has been a consistent theme. That certainly was a big theme with England or with Britain, where the first time that the sovereignty of Parliament was really broken was when they entered the European Union. And I think that's the deep reason why many conservative Brits really did not like being in the European Union because it was a diminution of the authority of a democratic parliament. And I think there's something of that in American thinking as well. However, you have to distinguish between different kinds of assertions of sovereignty. So I think that, bridling under the international dictates of less legitimate governments is one thing. The voluntary giving up or delegating of authority to an international body because you believe it is in your national self-interest to do so is perfectly legitimate, and that's actually an exercise of sovereignty. And so joining NATO or joining, the WTO or any of these international pacts is not really delegating any kind of permanent authority to an international body. It's just saying, we Americans think that our national interests are better served by this kind of international cooperation. And that's the point where, the current right, I think, gets into trouble because they just bridle against any, form of international cooperation, even if you can, show very clearly that it is in the national interest of the United States.
It's very interesting that you mentioned 1619, because as we move forward, we still have the British Commonwealth and parliaments that are started and opened in the name of a sovereign. It's the King of England right now. And so that connection is still intellectually there in a way that it is not for the United States. And Dan, if you'd like to jump in particular with this idea, Jennifer and Frank spoke about the right-wing versions of sovereigntist movements. The anti-WTO movement was a very lefty movement here in the United States.
Given that Jennifer invoked 1919 and Frank invoked 1688.
Yeah, I'm trying to bring it forward.
I feel like the real power move
somehow
would be to say, you have to go back to the Magna Carta, actually. But I'm not going to do that.
We can go back to the Athenian Code.
Yes,
if you'd
there
like
we
to
go.
do that.
Yeah. In terms of the progressive opposition, in some ways it ties into what Frank said, which was it really does start with the Uruguay round of GATT, the creation of the World Trade Organization, the protests that you see at Seattle. I think the deeper way of thinking about it, Danny Roderick once referred to it as a governance trilemma, which is that if you can only have two of three things. You can have functional global governance, democratic rule, and hyper-globalization. You have to give up one of those three. That if you have a hyper-globalized economy and you try to do it, with global governance, you have to give up democracy to some extent. And that was the sort of protest that I think a lot of the progressives had. The other thing the progressives tended to rail about was this idea that if you have a hyper-globalized economy, it would lead to a race to the bottom in terms of regulatory standards, and that essentially you were shifting the balance of power from labor to capital, because capital would be super mobile, whereas labor would not be. And to be fair to the progressives, that wound up having at least a grain of truth. In a weird way, a lot of their hysteria over the 1990s was wildly off in terms of what the effects of NAFTA were going to be or previous rounds of trade liberalization. What they wound up being right about, though, in retrospect, was the China shock, in the sense that the opening to China really did devastate certain communities in the United States. That even if, from a welfare perspective, from a national welfare perspective, you could argue it was a net gain, it also widened inequality in the United States, and that's one of the reasons why you had such a progressive backlash to globalization, and why even now, when you have Trump putting troops in streets or what have you, you have that strain of the left that says, but he had a point, in terms of why he won in 2016 or why he won in 2024.
Jennifer, is part of that point that the promise of this international system or the promise of a liberal democracy fell prey to political cronyism and political decay?
I mean, certainly there were problems with the post-war liberal order. And I think, actually, this allows me to bring together a couple of comments that I'd like to make based on what Frank and Dan said. So I think probably what would be useful here is to make a distinction between right, liberal, and left. I think we can say fairly clearly that the left criticism of, internationalism and the post-war international order, and liberal self-criticism of the order, were not sort of criticisms per se of international governance. They stipulated that the way it was conducted might be unfair, that it might preserve certain inequalities within it. There are like sort of legacy inequalities coming out of colonialism or informal imperialism. But they didn't stipulate that there was no such thing as a legitimate world government. In fact, they relied on it either as an extension for liberals of their own sovereignty project, right, to extend American power through international orders, or to rectify for the left, problems with international capital, imperialism, etc. It strikes me that the right, however, in the United States, that point of view of criticizing liberal internationalism is really almost a per se criticism, that it is on the face illegitimate to have international governance. And I just want to sort of situate a little more deeply the critique, if you'll permit me for a second, with history. I mean, the reasons for the critique in 1919 for no joining the League of Nations were rooted really in three things. One, the assumption that liberal international governance would usurp the US Constitution. Number two, that sort of adherence to international principles would somehow trample, hide the unique history and culture of the United States, which should be celebrated. But above all, that it would allow non-white, non-Christian people perceived as uncivilized to have a say over the United States and the people within the United States. And that skepticism about it, not rooted in our critique of authoritarianism or anything else like that, right? But a purely critique based on sort of racial and social hierarchies pervaded the sovereigntist right-wing movement throughout the 20th century. And when the UN was created, they were appalled that it would be dominated by what they called the, quote, Afro-Asian bloc, which would, do the same thing, allow what they thought were essentially unqualified people to have a say in international affairs. And it correlated quite clearly with their own hold on domestic politics at home. What would signing the Human Rights Convention do? It would threaten segregation in the United States, right? So I think draining the right-wing critique of sovereignty of that legacy and of its sort of per se criticism of the establishment of international governance doesn't really allow us to see clearly the spectrum on which international governance is debated from right to liberal to left.
Dan?
The only thing I would follow up on what Jennifer said is, again, this sounds weird, but to be fair, that right-wing critique had some validity to it. If you actually take a look at, here's a fun question. When was the last time the United States actually declared war on a country?
World War II.
It was World War II. And the reason, even though the Constitution empowers...
Military actions since then, right.
Right. And the beginning of this different way of the U.S. going to war was the Korean War, in which the United States did not go to Congress. It went to the UN Security Council. And it was the UN Security Council that authorized the action, the police action in Korea. Now, to be fair, presidents have also used military force without the UN. But there was a period, particularly in the 1990s, where very often the first move of a president was to go to the UN Security Council rather than Congress, as a way of sort of bypassing what Congress might have wanted. Now, we're in a world where Trump thinks he can do whatever he wants. He doesn't need Congress or the UN Security Council. But if you sort of trace the history of it, there was a valid concern that essentially, and this is a logic that political scientists and international relations scholars have talked about, is that very often heads of state, if there is a sort of strata of global governance and a strata of domestic governance, can play one off the other as a means of getting what they want no matter what. And even the leader of the United States can go to Congress and say, look, the UN really wants to do this, or the G20 really wants to do this, and it's a means through which they can at least provide some patina of legitimacy to what they're doing.
I don't want to lose the thread that Jennifer doubled down on, the idea of us and them and who gets legitimacy in these systems. But Frank, in terms of that, the challenges, the modern challenges to the promise of democracy, the promise of international agreements that will mutually benefit everybody, yet, and you've pointed this out, we're seeing this delinking of capitalism and democracy, particularly in places like China and Singapore. Is that part of the failure of liberal democracy?
Well, it's complicated.
I'm sure you can give us a 2-minute answer,
Yeah,
right?
okay, a 2-minute answer. So one of the, I think, important distinctions about people that use the word sovereignty, like what is the one country that actually insists constantly on the need for national sovereignty? It's China, a non-democracy, an authoritarian state. And I think that their use of the word sovereignty delinks the idea of sovereignty from any value concept like democracy or liberalism, right? That every country gets to determine its own form of government. That can be authoritarian, it can violate, supposedly universal standards of human rights, but they get the right to do that. And I think that what's interesting about these right-wingers that Jennifer is studying is that they could have taken, the justification that I was suggesting, that the reason you want sovereignty is because of democracy, right? That we are uniquely legitimate in our democratic decision-making system. We don't want anyone to impinge on that. But what I think is interesting about contemporary right-wing sovereigntists is they're also willing to say, well, we don't give a shit about who, what China does or Russia. They have their right to, their own form of government, as long as we get to make our, decisions. So you kind of delink the idea of sovereignty from the idea of democratic legitimacy. And I think that if you...
But that's because they value more capitalism.
Well, maybe. But
Can I push back on that a little? It's not that I disagree with you. It's that I think, honestly, one of the legitimately fascinating things about the current administration when it comes to these arguments about sovereignty is that on the one hand, you're absolutely right. Whenever the conversation comes up about, well, why aren't you criticizing what's going on in China or what's going on in Russia? Their argument is we don't care. It's not, we don't care about the domestic politics of those countries. They care deeply about the domestic politics of Brazil, of Germany, of France, of the UK. What is fascinating to me is that for a movement that simultaneously declares, you know what, it's an authoritarian country, but we don't care, we just got to do business with them, it's fine, sovereignty, so on and so forth. If the other country is a democracy, they are way more interventionist than the most liberal Democrat that's ever been elected. I mean, this is the part that I find legitimately fascinating, where you have J.D. Vance giving that speech about, in Munich, or you have the U.S. employing blatantly illegal sanctions against Brazil because of that country's prosecution of Jair Bolsonaro. And so it's this sort of hypocrisy of, on the one hand, yes, the rhetoric you're talking about is there, but on the other hand, when it comes to them dealing with other democracies, they'll intrude like nobody's business.
I actually think they're not hypocrites. I mean, the historical record is the groups that I'm looking at over time, which extend from, say, the Daughters and Sons of the American Revolution and the American Legion in the early period up through groups you might be more familiar with, like the John Birch Society, they're not Democrats. They stand for a constitutional republic, is what they say. And they're quite anti-democratic in the extension of the suffrage and the extension of civil rights. They make no bones about it. Populist they might be now, right? But that's not the same thing, of course, right? So I actually think that there's not so much of a contradiction there, and interfering in other people's democracies in order to make them less democratic seems to be part of the current iteration of a sovereigntist agenda on the right.
Which then brings us to where we wanted to look and dig deeper in the modern moment. Are we looking then at the wrong place by looking exclusively at fixing international agreements, whether it be the WTO, the World Health Organization, the UN system? Has that system baked into it already some of these inequities? And I'll add this data point. The United States is a multiracial, ethnically diverse country. And as a quote unquote mature democracy, we were meant to have equality and inclusion as part of our system, right? And we see where that has led us right now. It has not continued to evolve in that direction. So where should we be looking is it something that is not an international regime? Which we can answer in 5 minutes, I'm sure.
You're not looking at the historian first, right, to answer a question about the future?
That's
not my forte.
I will jump on the landmine.
Please
for you.
do.
I think there's a
Oh,
couple.
is that a loaded question?
I think there's a couple things going on here. The first is, and this is a valid critique to make of the sort of liberal international order, is that one of the problems with the liberal international order is that it's really tough to kill an international institution. Mm-hmm. International institutions rarely die. They're good at ossifying, but it's tough to kill them. And this creates a problem because whenever you want to say, hey, you know what, the current system is broken, we should create something new, the problem is that people say, well, no, we've already got this institution. What are we going to do? And what sometimes happens is you create a whole bevy of international institutions, and it turns out that if you have a increasing number of international institutions, it actually looks more Hobbesian, because then states can engage in forum shopping. Another thing that's worth pointing out, and I think it sort of drives the kind of right-wing belief about sovereignty, is that, you know, Frank said nation state to describe what's going on. And actually, nation state's one of these great terms that we throw around. Mm-hmm. But as you pointed out, the U.S. is not a nation state. We are a, state where presumably becoming an American is based on adherence to creed more than anything else. I mean, J.D. Vance would disagree, and that's in some ways what's going on.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. The right-wing, goal is to create a nation state. Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, that nation state is super white.
And to argue that that was the origin of the Constitution of the United States to begin with, right? It's a return to sovereigntist principles, hence the challenge on birthright citizenship. But that's what's made the United States unique in this democratic order. But I cannot show up tomorrow and identify culturally as British. Yeah. My parents moved here, and I can identify as American.
Right. The third thing I would say, and this goes back to something that Jack Goldsmith said yesterday on this panel, it's worth pointing out that I think one of the things we are all learning, when we talk about sovereignty, we tend to assume, well, this is about international law, right? Like, and international law is codified, there are texts, and we can interpret it and so forth. It turns out that an awful lot of international relations runs on norms and not laws. And as Jack said, put Donald Trump in a room with a norm and he's going to violate it. It's guaranteed to happen. And so what we're seeing is a decay, it's norm decay. A lot of things that we took for granted as this is the way things work, it turns out that was only true if everyone accepted that as given. We no longer accept it as given. And so we are migrating to a world where there aren't necessarily, or they're trying to write new norms. I'm not sure they're going to last, but it's a truly, Hobbesian kind of world out there at this point.
And Frank, India is the world's largest democracy, and it is ruled by bureaucratic paperwork and a system of laws that is very difficult for the average person to understand and navigate. It's also ruled by deep cronyism. Again, where does that lead us then in terms of solutions for a democratic or international order?
Well, there's a lot packed into that. I think that, first of all, you got to start by fixing the United States.
What?
I think that it's very, Americans are used to lecturing other countries around the world about their democratic systems.
We're really good at that.
Yeah, I was on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy for 18 years, and, that's a lot of what we did, these annual human rights reports and so forth.
To the resentment, as you mentioned, of many, many other countries.
Yeah, and I think that, the last few years have forced a big rethinking of all of that. It is true that the United States is extraordinarily powerful, not just in hard power, but also in the soft power about the model that it represents to other countries. And that's actually been one of the biggest sources of our power. But that soft power has been severely damaged, I think, by the kinds of internal deviations from not just democracy, but especially from the rule of law that we've experienced over the last few years and, greatly accelerated since January 20th. And I find it a little bit hard to see how you're going to correct the international side of this problem if you don't get your own institutions in, a little better order, because I think the moral authority with which the United States can, deal with other countries has really deteriorated.
Can I just,
Please
I've
do.
worked up my courage as a historian
this.
to say something about the
About the
future.
Sure, after I fell on the landmine, I mean, geez.
Thank you. I think this is it's a really interesting question. Do you seek to restore the liberal international order and preserve what can be preserved? Certainly, there are countries all around the world who are super invested in the success of it or the actual functioning of it for things that they need. Presumably, they will continue to use it, even if the US sort of pulls out or disparages it, defunds it. So at some level, it will sort of go on, as you said. At the same time,
And we see that right now with the European Union and its engagement vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine and the United States. Right? They are solidifying as a more active bloc.
Yes. And at the same time, I think if you pull way, way, way out, as historians are wont to do, to like 30,000 feet, it seems evident that the historical creation of things like states, nation states, liberalism, right? That these things have life courses. There's pressures on them. It seems to me we're at a moment of enormous pressure on states, nation states, and of course the liberal international order. And I do want to just say, I think one of the elephants in the room that you brought up repeatedly and nobody's taken the bait on is unfettered global capitalism. And its ability to sort of elude all of these restraints of states and also international governance. And that, I think, has put enormous pressure on the international system and on states in particular. And so, I think we're in for a quite, I don't know if I'd call it Hobbesian, but a very unruly period of international relations. And it's not clear to me that some of these things won't actually be captured and reformed 100 years from now in utterly different formations.
And to take that where Frank landed us with moral authority, right? Who has moral authority? And I, certainly as a former diplomat, there is a sense of humility about that had worked in recognizing the United States having challenges similar to other countries having challenges, but that sense of humility does not lead to a strong feeling of sovereignty or strong feeling of national identity. And unfortunately, the capitalist oligarch does bring people a sense of pride, or at least an individual and a certain class, a set of pride on the world stage. Dan, I was going to open it up to questions. Did you want to have the final word before I do that?
Just to be provocative, let me say a word.
When I threw in oligarch, that's not
I
provocative
want to
enough?
speak in praise of unfettered global capitalism for just a small second, which is to say, it's worth pointing out that the unfettered global capitalism has led to the most dramatic reduction in global poverty in world history. From 1995 to now, the percentage of the world's population that lives in...
Unfettered global capitalism or regulated
No,
capitalism?
I'm going to say unfettered to some extent. But here's where, and there's obviously a but, which is to say what it did do also was that it created, disadvantaged group. There were losers as well. It created distributional winners and losers, and the losers were primarily working class populations in the developed world. And so when you ask why the United States is where it is now, you do have to acknowledge that point. I just want to point out that I think it's become a stylized fact to say, well, we now know that globalization was a mistake or that hyperglobalization was a mistake. And I do want to push back strongly on that point to say that the mistake was not in opening borders to more trade and exchange. The mistake was, you could argue, that the state failed to have the proper compensatory mechanisms in place to compensate
And
the
the
losers.
state also failed to uphold its own values where it was doing business elsewhere.
Right, and this, by the way, does lead, the other valid
That's the moral authority challenge.
The other valid criticism is that, well, okay, we've had unfettered globalization. Now China, it turns out, controls an awful lot of what everyone else needs, and that's the valid international
And there were,
relations point.
again, this is a progressive lefty, universe that is combined in the anti-China space, centered on this idea of unfair labor practices, which is not just a today issue, as you'll rewind back to as we were exploring these international trade agreements. With that, I think we've tossed out enough food for thought for our audience. Would love to open it to questions. Please, if you would state your name, and is it a general question or anyone in particular?
Hi, my name's Samantha Hancox-Lee. I'm an editor at Liberal Currents, and this is a question for Dan, or anyone else if they just want to jump on it, whatever. So I was wondering, to take this back to Danny Roderick's trilemma and the sense, like there's a reason he called it the golden handcuffs, is the system that we're in now. And I'm wondering what you think about arguments that have been made by Michael Pettis, by Steve Randy Waldman, that this system has enabled unbalanced global trade, and that by not through tariffs, but through restrictions on the capital account, you can do this in various ways, but by restrictions on the international flow of capital, you can return both to a kind of a balanced global economy that, like you say, might be better for the American working class, and might also cut down on some of these excesses of global capital that people have been talking about. I'm wondering what you think about these kinds of proposals.
Mostly, I think it's a crock. Let me put it this way. I am extremely skeptical that the restricting global capital mobility, that you actually can do it. And the evidence I would point to, by the way, is the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia since 2022, which say this has not necessarily stopped, capital from going in or out to some extent of Russia. I get the impulse behind it, and I understand that. I think never underestimate the ability of capital to work a way around a rule, I guess. So this is not because I'm trying to praise capital. It's trying to say capital is devious, and you're not going to be able to necessarily pull that off. I think there were probably better ways to do it. I don't even necessarily disagree with Roderick on the idea that industrial policy might have been that subsidies rather than tariffs might be the more appropriate way of going about this, and if anything, you can argue that the Biden years are evidence of this, because the Inflation Reduction Act did lead to a surge of investment in the United States in green technology, which was what it was designed to do. So the idea that there should be more policy autonomy, that I do agree with Roderick on. The idea that like if we impose capital restrictions, that'll rebalance stuff. No, I'm not. I don't think that. I think towards that way also lies madness, because, and this is, I have to admit, the intellectually I am enjoying Danny squirming just a little bit at the fact that, that the Trump folks have taken some of his critiques and done the absolute worst policy imaginable as a result. And that's one of the things I always worry about, is that providing the justification for these sorts of things then leading to, Liberation Day winds up being the outcome that you have to be guarded against.
Hi, Sabina Čudić, Member of Parliament from Bosnia and Herzegovina. There seems to be this pervasive idea, particularly among Democrats in Congress, but also some liberal thinkers in the United States, that the priority should be to sort out things at home before having any foreign policy ambition in the short and medium term, considering the level of crisis in the United States. However, knowing, and this is a question for Francis, knowing that the vacuum never remains a vacuum, and that vacuum will be filled by other actors such as China, mainly Russia, Iran, at least in my part of the world. The question is, if we assume that this process is going to take 4 to 6 years at best, will the world be the same once the United States reemerges on the international scene? What will it mean for the United States internally, and whether there would be a possibility to simply, move on rather than deal with the consequences of isolationism of the past 4 to 6 years?
Yeah, look, I'm not saying that we should give up on trying to fix the world. To the extent that we still actually have people in the government that are interested in, for example, calling out human rights abuses, we should continue to do that and intervene. So even the Trump administration has done modest things, they just did this thing with Azerbaijan and Armenia, which has gone kind of under the radar. So that, yeah, we should continue to try to fix things as we can. I just think that it's very hard to really make a strong effort in that direction when you are doing things like having the State Department issue its annual human rights report that blames Germany more severely for human rights violations than El Salvador, right? I mean, in the past, what we should have been doing is condemning, Bukele's treatment of prisoners and, the complete contempt for the rule of law in that country. And instead we blame, one of the most successful liberal democracies in the world. And I just think that, you got to fix that stuff. You got to get back to a foreign policy that actually takes democracy and human rights seriously.
Derek Barker from the Kettering Foundation. I think anyone can answer this, but I'll pose it to Jennifer just because the others went to the others. But I guess I think where we started was a dichotomy between the international order and sovereignty. And I guess I want to push back on that. I'm seeing this through the lens of Ukraine, where sovereignty is very much at stake because they're facing an imperial power. So, I'm thinking sovereignty is maybe not such a bad thing when that's the alternative. Is there a way that we can, I think what we're trying to get at is a way of saying that sovereignty is actually not opposed to the international order, but rather figuring out a way that independent nations can voluntarily and in their own interest cooperate with the international order. And I guess I'm wondering, is there a way to make that argument to people on the right that you're seeing that are...
And I'll add on to that, or examples historically that you can think of that fit that model.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what is happening in the room, right, is a tension between sort of wanting to abstract and have some definable notion of what sovereignty is and what it means, and then the messy fact that, in fact, it is used quite differently by different people to mean different things for different political purposes. And one person's sovereignty is another person's repression, right? That's the way they feel. In the event, I do think there are ways that in the past, I'm speaking historically here, that those on the right who call themselves sovereigntists, who think of themselves as opposed to international governance, have in fact acted internationally. They're not isolationists, right? So it isn't a question of whether they will engage with the world. It's merely a question of how. For example, they're quite in favor of private international law, of course, and trade, the individual trade agreements. In terms of international solidarities, there were real and meaningful ones that I think were created with Rhodesia and South Africa. We might see them as, reprehensible and not models, but I'm just saying that they're the kind of affinities are not unlike the affinities that you see now between sovereigntists in the United States and those in Hungary, for example. So there are these possibilities, I think, for creating, it is what Viktor Orban has called a sovereigntist world order. He said this at the CPAC convention in Budapest in 2024 in April. And so they certainly imagine that there is some way of aligning that is nevertheless preserving their version of what governance and jurisdiction should look like in their own nations. I will just say that the most wild iteration of this that I saw, historically speaking, was a proposal in the 1950s by a group called the Federation for Constitutional Government, which was one of these sovereigntist constitutional groups in the 1950s for a white UN. And it was a full-on proposal that would be the solution, would be a white UN. So there are formations that they can imagine that are global at some level, but they're certainly not in the liberal or left internationalist model.
Who are you?
in the
Can
United
you
States.
introduce yourself, please?
Oh, I'm Charlie Cranmer. I'm just a retired guy. It seems to me there are a lot of people in the United States, maybe the majority, who, if you ask them where American sovereignty comes from, they would say, well, it derives from the will of God. And I'm wondering, and consequently compromise with foreign nations that have not been so blessed is inherently corrupting, or something like that. I'm wondering what you think about that. I think there's a religious aspect to a lot of what we've been talking about that is kind of under the surface, but isn't always addressed specifically.
And to say, not just in the United States, right? There's this tendency for higher order deference. Who wants to take that one?
I'm going to defer to the historian on this.
There we go.
I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, the fact that fundamentalist Protestants and very conservative Catholics were ardent sovereigntists in this vein, anti-internationalists, very wary of liberal internationalism in world government, is, I think, speaks to this fact. And there are historians who've written really well about the kind of long-term anti-internationalism embedded in for example, in a kind of Calvinist fundamentalist Protestantism that really sees world government as like apostasy. I mean, they actually define it as the Antichrist. You know, the sort
Isn't
of.
it a sign of like the Book of Revelations coming
No,
true?
for some people in more recent times it's been expressed that way, but it's really the folly of man in believing that man can solve problems like peace. And it's an insult and an affront to the, that's really only the ability of God to do it. And so it's sort of rooted in that Calvinist theology, and there's a famous theologian, Gresham Machen, from Princeton Theological Seminary, who sort of laid this out in the early 20th century United States as the reason to oppose the League of Nations, and followed by many, many fundamentalist evangelical preachers. But there were also conservative Catholics who understood that the only legitimate world government was, in fact, the Vatican, and that was the proper realm of any world governance, and anything else was not legitimate. And I can't speak to other countries, but I think you're quite right.
There's certainly a history of caliphates.
You're running the conference, just ask the question.
Okay, I'll pull my organizer prerogative here and jump in. One comment and then one question. The comment is, picking up on what Dan said, making a little pitch for unfettered capitalism, which is that, governments and the state can control many factors of production. They can certainly control labor, and you are seeing that right now. When you have a spasm of nativism in a country, nation states can control their border and will go to extraordinary lengths to control their border. The one thing that can actually control the power of the state is unfettered capital. So I wake up in the morning and I never looked at my 401k. Now when it goes down, I actually feel a little sigh of relief that there is some disciplining force to the forces of protectionism that we are seeing right now. So there is something to be said by some factor of production that's not controlled by the state. But my question is for actually Jennifer. Jennifer, at least I had been thinking that the worst thing that could happen in the United States is isolationism, that we retreat within a fortress, cut off external influences, labor, capital, cultural exchange. But then came sovereigntism. And sovereigntism is something even different. Maybe it's scarier, maybe it's less scary. But can you speak about the difference between isolationism and what I think we are seeing now, which is sovereigntism, and what it means for a sphere of power politics around the world?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would do is say that, historians took the term isolationism actually from the era of World War II, right? And they actually adopted the language of internationalists who were in favor of US involvement in World War II, who called those who were opposed isolationists. So it's a historically grounded term in that sense. And I think the studies by historians since of isolationism sort of reveal, there's a famous one by this historian, Christopher Nichols, that there really was never any true isolationism, that this question was never, would the US engage? It was just, on what terms would it engage? What would be the priority when it engaged? What would be the rules of that engagement? What would drive the engagement? And so I'm sort of skeptical that there's any isolationism per se, but had anyone thought for a moment that maybe Trump or some people, maybe less even Trump, but people in his administration were pure isolationists, I think we see now that really wasn't the case at all. And I'm not sure, really, what sovereignty will bring, except for what is said out loud, right? Which is, the statement for a withdrawal from the current liberal international order. It is a skepticism of other, groups that we aren't even involved with. So a skepticism about the EU, for example. We're not in the EU, but we seek to undermine it now under a sovereigntist Trump administration. Skepticism about NATO. NATO was always the target of sovereigntist anti-internationalists from the moment of its creation up through now. Trade agreements, IMF, World Bank, a receding from those. And that's stated in Project 2025. It says that they should not be renegotiated, they should be abandoned if they don't work to US ends. So I think that, where my eye goes is to the kind of growing alliance of leaders in countries that have a strong right now that call themselves sovereigntist, and what seems to be what will be hashed out sort of among them as a possible version of that, sovereigntist world order. I mean, to me, it looks unruly and unpredictable, but I really don't know what it is.
Could I make a comment? Ever since Trump 2.0 came into power, there's been this big debate about what's the nature of the world order that we are entering into. But I think building on something that Dan said earlier, that's a fool's errand, because I just don't think that there is a consistent set of principles by which you can understand the kind of world that's emerging, because essentially Trump is driven by opportunism, that if something looks like it's going to benefit him and his prestige personally, then he'll go for it. So you see this with the bombing of Iran. It was clear that there was this underlying isolationist impulse not to get involved in any more Middle East wars, and a lot of MAGA types, were really opposed to that. But then it turns out you do one bomb, you drop one set of bombs one time, it solves a problem pretty definitively. Why not take it? So he just goes in a completely different direction. And I think that's kind of the problem, is that, when you have this kind of opportunism in policy, you can't actually use something like sovereigntism to define what you expect, the behavior of the United States to be, because it's just going to be whatever, comes into Donald Trump's head at, one particular moment. So.
Which then argues for the very, very early definitions of a sovereign who makes the decisions.
Well, I mean, if you really want to tie this into political theory, it goes to Hobbes, right? Because Hobbes, in some ways, there's two sides to Hobbes. Hobbes believed that the state of nature was a war of all against all, and that is exactly how Trump and most of his cronies described the international environment. But the other thing that Hobbes talked about is that the sovereign should have no internal threats. There should be no internal sources of division. And that, was there a threat to the sovereign? Hobbes would say, yes. The threat was alternative domestic sources of power. And that is something that Trump absolutely embraces in terms of how he's thinking about running the country.
We have last question.
Hi, George Linzer. I published The American Leader. My question is for Francis. I wanted to pick up on, or anyone on the panel who wants to answer. I want to pick up on what you mentioned at the end of the panel discussion about oligarchs and the role of money in determining the sovereign powers, and the role of money also in the development of the post-war world order. In speaking about the nation state, it occurred to me that no one brought up the evolution of the corporate state. And so I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that the comment that Shika made about the markets, the role of markets as a potential check against untrammeled executive power is right. So that's probably a good thing. But the nature of our capitalist system now isn't just that you have these broad markets that push back against certain actions. You have individual oligarchs that have so much concentrated wealth that they can actually sway elections. So, you know, Elon Musk donating $250 million to Donald Trump in that election, it's hard to see, you know, earlier precedents for that kind of use of financial power and translating that directly into political power. This is, I wrote about this. I had this blog post a while ago entitled Silvio Berlusconi and the Decline of Western Civilization, because I think that Berlusconi actually invented a form of oligarchy that is new. It's very prevalent in Eastern Europe, a lot of former communist countries, where you have a rich person who then buys a media property, not because it's valuable as a media property, but because it's politically valuable. He uses that to get political power, and then he uses political power to protect his business interests. And this is a pattern that we're seeing, you know, repeated now in, you know, Ukraine, you know, Czech Republic. I mean, a lot of Eastern European countries have this particular form of oligarch problem, and now we're seeing it develop in the United States, and I don't think that's very healthy for democracy.
Let's not forget about the robber barons and the Gilded Age.
Well, but no robber baron actually did what Elon Musk has done, right? No individual robber baron succeeded in gaining that degree of, you know, individual political power.
Well, I mean, William Randolph Hearst, you know.
Yep, Hearst and the Rockefellers.
Spanish-American War.
We just
I
haven't
agree with
experienced
Frank.
it in our
This is
lifetime.
more.
That's a big, we haven't experienced it. It's been history. We think it's the past. All right, I think, we do have time for one more.
This is a question that relates to the theme of this entire conference, which is, can we put together positive arguments for liberalism rather than just deploring the erosion under the current administration? So I'm going to throw out some arguments for a liberal international order and ask the panelists, and I guess everyone here, would you be willing to make these arguments for why the liberal international order compared to unfettered, unbridled sovereignty is a good thing? So one of them would be human rights, and my understanding is that some of the international institutions and agreements, such as the Declaration of Human Rights in the wake of World War II, came to deal with the argument that in prosecuting Nazi Germany after the war, there was an argument that the Nazis could only be prosecuted for the genocide that they perpetrated on Polish and Romanian soil, that what they did within their own boundaries was no one else's business. And so countries have full sovereignty, they can massacre their citizens, and no one else gets to say anything about it. Contrary to that idea, international agreements like the Declaration of Human Rights says that sovereignty does stop when it comes to human rights, which are a global interest. That's one argument. Another one would be that just getting back to the Hobbesian construction of international anarchy, just as in becoming a citizen of a country, we agree to sacrifice a certain amount of our own autonomy, our own sovereignty, if you will, that in order to be free of the depredations of others, that's the basic social contract. I sacrifice my freedom to lie, to cheat, to rob, to steal, to murder, because on average, I'm better off if everyone else sacrifices their right to rob, steal, cheat, murder, and so on, and that therefore it's in the interests of sovereign states to sacrifice some of their sovereignty if everyone else agrees to sacrifice it as well for the benefit of the entire community of nation states. Yeah, a third one, and this was raised by Daniel, is that if you ask the question of what the effect of globalization has been on inequality, it has massively reduced it at the international level. The Gini index across countries, and probably the Gini index for the world as a whole, has gone way down simply because poor countries have gotten richer faster than rich countries. And as Daniel pointed out, to the probably to the detriment of some factory workers in rich countries. But if all human lives are equal, then maybe several 100 million people being better off is worth the price of several 100,000 people having to find new jobs. That would be a third argument. I'm not, by the way, making these so much as asking, would these be viable ways of defending a liberal international order? And finally, the fourth one would just be the empirical record that since World War II, the world has been better off both in terms of massively increased affluence, including especially at the low end, the decline of extreme poverty to less than 8% of the world's population, and the fact that great power wars and interstate wars in general have declined, notwithstanding the invasion of Ukraine, which is in many ways anachronistic, but the great powers have not fought a war since the Korean War, in contrast to millennia of human history where the great powers were constantly at each other's throats. So the international liberal order has worked in the sense that the world's gotten richer and more peaceful on average. Anyway, those are four arguments.
So
Are we prepared to make them?
I think, yes, our team would be prepared to make those in the interest of time. Just wanted to mention that. And I do appreciate you wanting to end on a positive note. That is essentially the challenge of the premise of this panel, was to dig into the exact opposite of the liberal world order. Who would like to start?
I mean, those are the arguments that, liberals made for why to have the order in the first place. The question is why those arguments seem not to work right now. I think in part it seems that where there was once, so if you look at the US population, there was at a time when Americans were in favor of internationalism. My sense is that that was always very soft support, and that it hasn't been able to hold up under critiques, failings, mobilized movements on the right, and some less successful on the left. And so it seems that there are things that will need to be added to that. There will be components of internationalism that liberals will have to think about. For me, probably a little bit more in the material. It's not enough to say globalization overall did this. It let freed capital, but not labor. It did not control for environmental degradation. There were all kinds of things. Maybe adding things to the list of what now liberalism proposes that it could do. Ways that it could answer would be important, and connecting, I think, more to real social movements. That's what's made the sovereignty movement successful over time. It's not abstract arguments, it's not political high ground, it's mobilization of everyday people and their fears, and I think trying to mobilize at the grassroots level people to feel connection to a reason to support internationalism that benefits people in the way that you say, but in additional ways as well, is probably necessary. I don't know how to do that.
Or, as we experience here in the United States, just even the idea of democracy does not resonate in this in a similar way when it comes to organizing and mobilizing.
So I'd say three things in response. The first is that, sure, I can be a cheerleader for the Kantian triad, big fan of it, and if nothing else, just for the Churchillian argument of, even if you think it's not a great system, it's so much better than any of the alternatives. So perfectly willing to embrace that point. But I will close on two downbeat notes. The first is that to push back on your argument that the world is actually pretty peaceful, take a look at the Uppsala conflict data program. We are experiencing the most number of interstate and intrastate conflicts since 1945. Whatever arguments were made about the elimination or the reduction of interstate conflict, that was true in 2010, it's not true now. And so the order is not working. And the final point here is that the real problem, I think, and the best argument that sovereigntists or others would make about critiquing the liberal international order is, then tell me why Russia and China have turned out the way they have. That the basic argument was, okay, you engaged with them, the idea was that they were going to get richer, they would then become more democratic, and they would become more like us. And that didn't happen. Now, the Kantian response would be, well, okay, maybe what we need is a more exclusive system that cuts out China and cuts out Russia until they're ready to join. But then that creates the awkward situation in the global economy of how exactly you cut China out of it. Because I don't think you can do it right now. And that creates real problems.
I'd also say we have a tendency to ignore conflicts in the global south as
Oh, sure.
legitimate conflicts or being recognized at all.
Well, I had one final comment that's a real downer, so maybe I'll just skip it.
Again, that was the premise of the panel.
Well, okay, one argument you could make in favor of giving up sovereignty in certain key areas has to do with nuclear weapons. That nuclear weapons are the ultimate guarantee of sovereignty, but we've had a peaceful world order since 1945 because two very powerful countries, Germany and Japan, essentially gave away their sovereignty and put it in the safekeeping of the United States. And if you're moving towards a world in which that guarantee of sovereignty across borders is not working, then everybody's got a much greater incentive to get nuclear weapons. Actually, I think the lessons of Iran and Iraq are not that it's really dangerous to do that, it's just you better do it really quickly and get those weapons, before anyone can take you out. And so that's also a general argument for, the old world. The trouble is it doesn't have any political force because all these threats are very theoretical. But at some point, something really bad is going to happen. And I think we're going to regret, going into a sovereigntist world where nuclear weapons become really central to, state security.
Thank you, Frank, Dan, and Jennifer. Clearly, we could continue.